Hello. Um, Today we're going to talk to you about trauma-informed systems. But first, I want to introduce myself. I'm Ken Epstein. I'm a leadership coach for Trauma Transformed. Antoine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so my name is Antoine Moore, and I am a leadership coach as well at Trauma Transformed.
So I want to start with an overview. Trauma-informed systems is a way of imagining a paradigm shift in your organization. Trauma, of course, is something we understand that's happened for individuals, it happens for families, it happens for communities, and yes, it happens in organizations. And the model we're talking about today addresses how you can address trauma in your organization as it relates to and induces trauma and how to reduce trauma for your staff. Hey, Antoine, would you start with a description of what a trauma organized organization looks like?
So the thing to note is that individuals whose lives have been affected by trauma, that this begins to impact them in a very visceral, embodied way. They actually begin to present themselves and to live their lives differently than prior to the trauma. And so some of those things that happen for a person whose life has been impacted by trauma is they might, for example, become hypervigilant. They might become reactive. There might be moments in which they numb out or they avoid. There might be ways in which they want to really control their environment, themselves and their environment. And so some of those characteristics that show up in individuals whose lives have been affected by trauma also begin to show up for the workers and the institutions that are working with the individuals whose lives have been affected by trauma. So this is very, very predictable that over time, individuals who are working in this field will begin to experience potential symptoms that mimic the trauma response. And the thing that we have to be thinking about is, if we know that that's highly predictable, then how do we reorganize our institutions with that idea in mind? What can we do to subvert that? So some of the things that we might be looking at is, for example, that people become reactive. So in institutions, there can be a way in which people get so focused on doing the work and attending to crisis and this crisis after the next crisis, that they're not necessarily stepping back to look at the broader picture. They're just reacting, just going to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Mm-hmm. Or it could be that people see big events might have happened in the life of the institution, like there might have been budget cuts, there might have been people have been laid off, there might be some there was violence that happened in the neighborhood. Something could have happened in the institution, and those things that happened, we hear the stories, and the stories keep coming back over and over. They never get metabolized over time. So even though it happened 5-10 years ago, we still hear about those things. So people become fragmented. There's atomization. There's those of us who are fighting for the clients who are doing direct service versus those people who are in administration, and we're trying to keep the doors open and fund these things, and that there's fighting in between in the institution. So anyhow, under enough stress, people can become very authoritarian. And that we're focused on making things happen instead of being more collaborative and open and involving people. So these are all ways in which the institution might begin to drift to become more trauma organized. And what we know is that if we don't find ways to transmute the trauma that comes into our personal systems, then we will transmit them onto other people. So the institution becomes trauma inducing. So it's important for us to be thinking about what's the model for understanding what's happening and what do we do about that. And so for that, I would like to switch it back to you, Ken.
Great. Thank you, Antoine. Sometimes it's hard to imagine those systems as baked into an organization. We see these as symptoms of a person. And, the old adage that now has been repeated over and over again, to move from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. We're actually giving you this paradigm to move from what's wrong with the organization to what's happened to the organization. And the first step in that transition from what's wrong to what's happened is becoming trauma informed. And there is no trauma informed without racial justice, and there is no racial justice without relational healing. And so we see the sort of center point of moving from a trauma organized to a healing organization as this trauma informed. And it means that we're understanding that we all have a common language, understanding what the nature and impact of trauma and recovery is. So we understand what's happening to us and to the organization. That we have a shared language, that we all can speak a language that understands both the science and the relational impacts of trauma. We know that trauma happens in the context of relationships and that healing happens in the context of relationships. And therefore, we need to be relationship based. And we have to recognize the ways in which we've been trained in sociocultural way and biases and structural oppression so that we can address these issues systemically. If we don't have a common understanding, we'll continue to induce trauma. And, we often say that, that training is important, but not sufficient. Or another way of saying it is there's the train and pray method. You can train somebody and then pray that they'll do something different. The third box really moves us to the different. If the second box, trauma informed, is about how we get into a common place, the healing organization is how we move from that common place to changes. And what you see is the idea that our organizations have relational characteristics that can be measured. Now, one of the ways you can understand that is that we're in the healing profession and that our healing profession should have language that goes along with healing. But you often see language like productivity or efficiency, or you see language like deliverables, as opposed to like language like engagement. And funny, it turns out you can bill for engagement. So you begin to see that in the healing organization, we're asking people to build action plans that really have measurable aspects of relational healing in organizations that we can move towards. Can we measure reflection in our organization? You can measure it by having reflective supervision or having spaces where people can make meaning out of the past. Is it an organization that's growth and prevention oriented? Is it not, or is it living in the reactive world? Are collaborations not only valued but measured in terms of their importance? Are equity and accountability not just plans getting dust on the desk, but you can see the changes in both the composition of leadership and the way in which policies are implemented and practiced. And are we practicing relational leadership, meaning that we're connecting with people and understanding that connection is the key aspect towards healing and reparation. And in those kinds of environments, and you could add whatever you want to this box in terms of measurable, you can measure joy, respect, all sorts of aspects of relational healing that you would want in your organization to know that you're reducing trauma for your staff, for your administrators, and ultimately for the communities we serve to improve the outcomes that we're achieving with our communities. So for this reason, we see this trauma organized, trauma informed to healing organization paradigm as a shift from the train and pray to actually an action plan that allows us to make a paradigm shift in our work.